Welcome to Train Signal. You are watching Implementing Cisco UCS Start to Finish. So this is what I consider to be a wrap-up lesson, and it's something that I wanted to add into the course for a couple of reasons. First of all, over the years I've taken a number of implementation courses and things like that, and what I've always found, well, I won't say always, but in most cases, courses do a great job of explaining a product or a technology, the features, implementation steps, things like that. But in the end, they don't usually wrap everything together, so sometimes it can feel a little bit disjointed. And that's the purpose of this lesson is I wanted to do a start to finish, what to expect, and kind of an order or recommended order for going through and implementing UCS. Now, you don't have to do it in the order I'm telling you. You can do anything you want to do. But for someone that's new and maybe has just gone through this course and may feel a little bit overwhelmed with all the different options and configurations and things to worry about, I wanted to lay this out and kind of give you a linear path. And really, I mean, the course lessons are a linear path, but it's a lot of information. It's hard to kind of distill that down into something usable, and that's what I want to do here. So what I have is just slides that go through recommendations and everything from start to finish. So we're going to start with before you order. You may have already ordered your UCS gear. If that's the case, that's fine. But maybe I'll give you a couple things to think about or look at and just confirm. Then we'll talk about what you should do when your gear arrives, cabling configuration, starting the configuration process, basic configuration in UCS Manager, administration, monitoring configuration. Then we'll worry about storage and network config, and finally service profiles and deploying systems. So hopefully this will give you a good view end to end. So before you order, well, there's a couple of things here, and I do a lot of pre-sales work with customers. So these are a lot of things that I try to keep in mind when I'm talking to customers and someone looking at using UCS. So first of all, size your environment for your needs. Choose the right size fabric interconnects, not just for today, but look at what you're going to be doing 6 months, a year, or 3 years from now. And in fact, I see interconnects and chassis as longer term investments than that. Now, Cisco does have a process, and we have done it to upgrade interconnects. We have people that started with 6120s and went to 6140s or went to 6248s, and there is a process for that. But if you don't have to do it, don't do it. When you're sizing and comparing blades, look at the different CPUs and look at the memory combinations. Memory gets cheaper every day. It used to be that 8 gig DIMMs were 3 or 4 times the price of 2 4 gig DIMMs, and now it's linear. And these days, 16 gig is close to what 2x8 are. So things change over time, and keep an idea of where your memory combinations and where your best bang for the buck is. Now, Cisco, at least in the past, and they may not always do this in the future, but I expect it to continue for a while, does bundles for starter configurations from 4 blades up, and they also do expansion packs for new blades. So you may want to add 3 blades to your environment, and you can go and get kind of this pre-built configuration called an expansion bundle. And so the idea is Cisco picks kind of the best bang for the buck chips and memory configuration and offers that at a good price and cuts down all the custom ordering that goes on. So look at those as well. On my blog, again, jason-dash.com, usually when new bundles are released every quarter or every 6 months, I go over them, tell you what's different, kind of how things line up. So even if you're not looking to buy from me, and I'm not asking you to, but go out and I'll try to give you an idea of what the current offerings are. That way you can go and see what to ask for. So once you've kind of sized the environment, looked at your chassis, your configurations, confirm power requirements of the configuration. Make sure you have the right power cables. This is the #1 issue on implementations we have. It happens. It's not the end of the world. Cables are easy to get, but we want to make sure that we hopefully don't have to redo something. So make sure the correct cables are ordered. Check space in the rack for initial install as well as future growth. If you're planning to expand on chassis, look and see what your options are. We talked about cabling. We talked about how twin axis cheap and fiber optic SFPs are not. So you want to keep your chassis close to your interconnects. You don't want to go buy 8 or 16 10G base SR SFPs for $500 or $700 a pop. So try to keep the chassis close to the interconnects. go ahead, and it's usually a good idea when you're starting to plan this, to plan out your schemes for your identity pools, your MAC, your UID, WWN, WWPN, things like that. Keep in mind your environment again might grow, so we talked about some suggested naming schemes for those, for site ID and cluster ID and different OSs and things like that. So it's a good idea to at least start putting some thought behind that. Verify distance to other switches and again confirm proper SFPs get ordered. If you need to do, let's say you have a Nexus 7000 core, some 5500s, check the length and see if you can use twin-ax or active twin-ax for that. If you can't, then make sure you get the right 10G base SR or long haul, the LR cables or SFPs, make sure those are ordered, and make sure the right fiber optic cables are ordered. And have your vendor or Cisco look for any product holds or delays. This happens. Cisco's a big just-in-time manufacturing behemoth. Sometimes this will cause holds. We've had cases where the customer has everything except the interconnects and they're on a 6-week delay. So you can't do anything without the interconnects. I mean, I can put the chassis in the rack and talk about how pretty it is, but that's about it. You want to confirm that, especially if you've got other projects waiting on UCS equipment. Now, times have gotten significantly better. We normally aren't waiting that long, but things happen. Things happen outside of everyone's control. You know, we just had issues with hard drive availability across the entire industry, which caused everybody to have delays. So sometimes Cisco can't help it when, you know, there's a supply issue and everybody's on delays. You need to keep that in mind. So maybe if the hard drives are out of stock or you can't get them, really look hard again at boot from SAN and things like that where you may not need hard drives. Do you have 10 gig in your network now? Are you going to add it? You know, are you going to uplink at 1 gig, which we don't recommend, but it does happen due to just, you know, reality. But if you're going to add 10 gig, make sure you get the right modules for your core switches. Make sure you get the right SFPs or GBICs to go for those modules. And a lot of times when we're adding modules to say a 6500 Catalyst, we have to use different. We can't use SFP Plus, the little tiny nice SFPs. We have to use old Zenpaks or X2s as they're called. So you want to make sure and confirm you use the right or get the right ones. Make sure you have modules and SFPs for the other end. A lot of these starter pack bundles from Cisco come with 10 gig modules for the interconnects. They don't come with enough usually for the other side. They usually come with 4, and I recommend you do at least 2 connections or interconnect to the core switch. That way a single cable or SFP failure doesn't cause a whole fabric to fail over. So you want to make sure and get the right modules for the other end. And do a port count. If you're doing more than one chassis, or you're really going to load up chassis, do a count and make sure your fabric interconnect licensing is good. So go ahead and get that at the time of your order so you're not scrambling to add that later on. You know, remember, all ports are licensed. Interconnects do include some licensing like the 6248s. Each of those comes with 12 ports licensed. So if you're only doing a single chassis, or maybe even, you know, 2 chassis without a lot of uplinks, you might be fine. But again, count that out and make sure you get the proper licensing. So what do you do when the gear arrives? So a lot of boxes just showed up. Are you doing the implementation? Is a partner doing the implementation? Well, hopefully, honestly, if you're listening to the course, I hope you're doing the implementation. That's a great way to learn. So look at what you got and compare it with your order. Check the packing list and make sure and locate all your small parts like SFPs. More than one time I've been scrambling around an office building looking for a small box with some 10 gig SFPs. We're at a complete standstill until we find them. So gather all that up. If you have any other licensing information, make sure you have that. If you didn't order cables with the UCS gear on the same order, make sure you get those. You need Cat 6 cables or Cat 5e or whatever for management 0 and L1, L2. And you're probably going to need fiber cables for fiber channel connectivity. Or if you're using the 10G base SR, LR SFPs, you're going to need fiber cable for those. So make sure you get the right length and the right type. You know, and those are easy enough to find at local places a lot of times if you didn't order them, but it's always good to have them there ready to go. Also make sure you got the right link twin-ax cables for going from the I/O modules up to the interconnects. Go ahead and rack the gear. We normally do interconnects at the top of the rack and chassis where they can fit. Use teamwork. Use a lift for the chassis. Even with everything pulled out, those chassis are very heavy. Again, they're also very deep, so make sure you have enough clearance in the back of the rack. Install the modules, power supplies, the fans, fabric interconnect modules, the blades. Go ahead and put power to everything if you want to and get it ready to go. Some cabling information, refer back to the live lab that we did. Shows you a lot of your cabling. So connect your interconnects to the management network via those management 0 interfaces. Cross-connect the cluster links. Again, I've said this probably 100 times, and I know you're tired of hearing it, but L1 to L1 and L2 to L2. Go ahead and connect the I/O modules in the chassis to the fabric interconnects. Don't cross the I/O modules. Again, that's something else I've said 100 times, but just make sure. Usually we do the left interconnect goes to fabric A, the right interconnect goes to fabric B. Make sure you do the right number, 1, 2, 4, 8. Can't do 3, can't do 5, can't do 6, can't do 7. 1, 2, 4, or 8. And if applicable, connect your fiber channel cables from each interconnect to a single fabric. So fabric interconnect A probably goes to your fiber channel fabric A. Fabric interconnect B goes to your fiber channel fabric B. And then connect each interconnect to your up-level core distribution switches. And you can cross-connect those. So go ahead and make sure that's done. I suggest you use port channels for those, port channels for fiber channel. We'll get to that here in a second. So then you start the configuration process like we did in the initial configuration lesson. Have your 3 IP addresses ready and the associated network information. Connect to the first fabric interconnect with a serial cable. If you're like me and you don't have a computer with a serial port, you're going to need a USB to serial adapter. I use one I got from Radio Shack. It was $30. It goes everywhere that I go. Not everywhere, but everywhere I go for deployment. And then perform your initial cluster configuration, just again as we did in the lesson. Choose a cluster name. Remember, it will append -A and -B for the respective interconnects. So when you're done with the first one, boot the second interconnect and have it join the cluster. Then confirm you can ping both the management 0 IP addresses, one on each interconnect, as well as a shared cluster IP. So make sure that's all good. And then go ahead and log into the cluster IP, admin, into UCS Manager. Next, we're actually starting configuration of UCSM. So set the basic policies. Again, we went over these in the lessons. Chassis discovery policy sets your minimum number of uplinks. Power policy sets your redundancy mode for the chassis. So if you got 3 power supplies, you may do N+1. If you have redundant feeds and 4 power supplies, you may do grid redundancy. Pick the appropriate one. Then configure your server uplink. So basically go into UCSM, right-click on the ports that connect to your I/O modules, and set them as server uplink ports. And I suggest you go ahead and update the firmware to the latest. That's something we did late in the course, but I suggest you do it before you start going through configurations in case defaults or anything else changes. So go ahead and run the latest. And then go ahead and configure some configuration backup jobs. As we talked about, you can't schedule those, at least in current versions of UCSM, but go ahead and set them up, and when you get done with configuration, make sure and do a backup. Next is kind of administration and monitoring configuration. So nothing too exciting here, but if you're going to authenticate against, say, LDAP or Active Directory, go ahead and configure that now. And if used, don't forget to add the schema edition. Create any custom roles, any custom organization structure, any locales that you want to use, and go ahead and create the management IP pool, keeping in mind it has to be on the same subnet and same VLAN as the management 0 interfaces, again, in current UCSM. I hope that changes one day. Next is just basic stuff. Set DNS server, NTP and time zone. Go ahead and configure your call home. You'll probably want to call TAC and confirm that configuration. And if you needed to buy additional licenses, make sure those go ahead and get installed. Do that up front, not later, because that's the one thing that people forget to do. And again, current versions of UCSM, they don't cut you off. But at some point that's going to change, and I don't want you to get in a bad spot, so just go ahead and do that up front. Then we get into the real configuration. If you're not going to do fiber channel, you're just going to boot off local disks in the blades and use ISCA as your NFS, you don't really need to worry about most of this. But if you're going to do fiber channel, you need to confirm some things. Get the proper SFPs for both ends, 4 gig, 8 gig, whatever you use. Enable NPIV mode on your fiber channel switches, and go ahead and create your WWNN and WWPN pools. Connect cables to your FC switches. Again, remember, fabric interconnect A goes to A, B goes to B. Enable storage uplink ports in UCSM, confirm they're green, and I suggest you go ahead and do port channels if you can, if you have Cisco MDS. So you'll need to configure port channels on the switch as well as in UCSM. Make sure they come up green and everything's happy. Create your vSANs as well, and make sure those come up on both sides. If you're going to use pinning groups, go ahead and create those. And feel free, if you've already done your WWNN and PN pools, you can do some pre-zoning right now for those and go ahead and get that ready as you deploy service profiles. Network configuration is the other side of that coin. So confirm modules and SFPs in the uplink switch that you plan to use. Configure the ports as directed in the lesson. Configure VLAN trunking on those ports. Configure spanning tree edge port configuration as we saw in the lesson. Go ahead and create all needed VLANs in UCSM. Cable up the connections between the interconnects and the switches. And once, just like fiber channel, I suggest you use port channels. If you're going to use pinning groups, go ahead and make them and create your MAC address pools now. And finally, service profile. So you're up, you pretty much got everything ready to go. If all the lights are green and everything's happy, you're kind of ready to start deploying blades and operating systems. So create your policies and your UID pools. You can do it up front or during service profile creation like I did in the lab in the service profiles lesson. BIOS and firmware policies, VNIC and VHBA templates, any server pools if you're going to use them, local disk policies. I suggest you set a user acknowledged maintenance policy. If you're going to use VMFACS, you're going to need to do like a dynamic VNIC configuration policy. Anything like that, go ahead and do it either up front or during service profile creation, and then create your service profile templates. If you're going to have Windows, Linux, and VMware all running on this guy, go ahead and create 3 standard templates. If it's just VMware or just Windows, just go ahead and create one, but it makes sure that everything is consistent. Once you do that, then you can start deploying your service profiles as needed, and now your UCS systems is up and running and in production. So when you look at it, it's a very methodical task. And when you get to this point, make sure you do another configuration backup so that you've got it. But again, very methodical. You can do things very linearly. It's not a complicated install. I mean, I can probably go into a lab now and stand up an entire UCS environment in just a couple of hours. It's not that complicated. Just walk through everything, check everything, especially storage and networking as you go. Make sure all the lights are green, there's no issues. Go ahead and update your firmware, and you're pretty much done. Start deploying service profiles, see what you can do, play around with moving them around the different blades, and show the system off and see what the capabilities are. So that's it. I mean, that's it for this lesson. We just kind of walked through end to end what it takes to order, install, implement, and stand up an entire UCS environment. So before your order, just get your ducks in a row. Make sure you got space, make sure you've got power, make sure you know where everything's going to go, you know what kind of power cables you need, and you know what kind of blades and configurations you want to order. Then when the gear comes in, just confirm that everything you ordered arrived, check your packing list, round up all the equipment and the SFPs, and get the stuff in the rack. Cabling is easy. Showed you a live demo of that. Just cable up your management, your L1, L2s, cable up your FEX to interconnect cables, and you can go ahead and cable up your fiber channel and network if you want to. And then start the configuration process. So we bring the first interconnect online, give it some basic cluster information, and then have the second interconnect join the cluster. After that, you log into UCS Manager, and start doing things like your chassis and power policies, simple things like that. On to administration, NTP, time zone, call home, those sorts of things. And then the real configuration, what I think is the real configuration process, which is storage and network. So go ahead, if you have to work with a different team for that to get the other ends configured, go ahead and get that started. Make sure they enable NPIV on the switches. Make sure you know which vSANs to create. Make sure they enable the correct spanning tree edge on the network. They trunk the proper VLANs, and you get a list so you know which VLANs to configure in UCSM. And then once everything is up and good, start creating your service profile templates and spawning your service profiles off of it, and you're ready to start deploying blades. So that's it. That's everything kind of in a nutshell, and gives you a really good idea of what a true implementation start to finish looks like. So with that, that's the end of this lesson, and I want to thank you again, and I hope to see you again on the next one.